Hello everyone, this is Philosophy 74, right? Ethics, and this is week 12 for us, so the last week really of the semester, and then next week, right? Uh, Thursday, the 11th, June 11th, we will have a Zoom meeting, the last meeting, right, just to conclude the class, and at 8:30, I will schedule it, and that's also the last possible day for you to submit all the assignments. Okay, so if you haven't done so yet, then make sure that you do by June 11th at the latest. Okay, so today I want to speak about, right, this last text that we are reading this semester, violence and civility. I call that's the keywords that I use in the syllabus. By we are reading an essay by Etienne Balibar, this French philosopher, right? And then the discussion board entry will be on that, especially on the concepts that we will find on page 22 of this essay of ultra subjective and ultra objective violence. Okay, basically the essay is similar to an essay which is contained in this book, Violence and Civility. Although it has a different title, some differences. So this is the limits on the limits, I believe, of right, that's the title for us, Violence and Civility on the Limits of Political Anthropology. Okay, so we are reading just this essay, which is also included in that book that I just showed. But in any case, I want to be brief today, quick, just highlight a few points for you, and again, read the essay, especially pay attention to the highlighted sections. But before we move into the essay, I also want to, as always, just to make sure that we know where we are at the end of the semester, right? See again, look at the trajectory, okay, of the semester so far, so that we have some sense also of continuity. And so we began with the section 4 weeks on the distinction between ethics and the law. That was the title of the section. Right, we read the first second week we did speaking about the just and the unjust law. We saw Plato's Euthyphro and the apology, right? So we read about Socrates and Plato, and then we moved from there the next week into Antigone by Sophocles, right? This tragedy, Greek tragedy, which you should keep in mind what the main themes, problems were in that, because again, this is something that continues, and we find the same questions, the question of violence, for example, today as well, right? So, and then the same week we also saw Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, speaking about the unwritten, unchanging laws and so on. Again, the difference, the distinctions, often the conflict between ethics, let's say the moral law, and the human-made, legal, so to speak, law. And then we saw week 4 we did Kant, right? Immanuel Kant's notion, especially of the categorical imperative. And then we moved from there to the second part of the class that I call happiness, excellence, dependency, and care, right? So we saw Aristotle, right? 2 weeks we stayed with books, 3 books from his right, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which again comes handy today, just like Antigone's, Sophocles' Antigone. We should keep that in mind. And then we did the week 8, week 7. We did Epictetus, right, Emmanuel, right. Remember the question of the distance from the emotions, governing the emotions, and then introducing that week the question of care, to which we also turned week 8 with Eva Kitei, and right, the question of a dependency as well, right? We read an essay by her, and then we move to the next part of the class, which is called now, these last 4 weeks, the ethics of civility. I use civility precisely, based on this essay that we are reading by Balibar. Okay, so then the first week we did of this section, week 9 in the semester, we saw some short sections from Spinoza's Ethics, right? And then Nietzsche from On the Genealogy of Morality. And then week 11, last week, we read Walter Benjamin's Critique of Violence, right? And difficult, dense essay. And today, Balibar, which is also kind of difficult. Maybe some things are new for many of you, but let's see. Again, I don't want to again be too long today, and just highlight a few points. I already mentioned these notions of the ultra objective, ultra subjective violence, and really the destruction of politics and agency and action, basically the power to act, the power of acting, the possibility of doing things. So, but this is very interesting and very timely, especially today. We of course know that the whole history of modernity, but human history in general, and the 20th century and now the 21st century, all these in all throughout this history and this time, we are always confronted and confronting the question of violence in important ways. Okay, and today, right, with everything that is happening in relation, right, after the brutal killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and we see the the protests everywhere, and the brutal, very often repression also of constituted power in the form of the police very often, and in other forms. We see what this means, especially today, and how this question of violence is unfortunately very present, very important, right? So in any case, that's what Balibar, Etienne Balibar, who has written so much about this and other questions too, political philosophy especially, he says at the beginning that in this essay what he's looking at is precisely the relationships, right, between violence and politics understood as civility. Okay, that's what civility in quote, right, means, right, and so that's on page 9, which is the first page in the essay. So I want to call attention to some fundamental points, and again I had to be sketchy, but on page 10 he speaks about this very important concept of extreme violence, which is what we very often experience, we see, we witness, let's say, at the level of it's not simply behavioral violence, right? But that too, but especially institutional violence, extreme violence that goes to the point of exterminism, right? In situations like genocidal regimes that Balibar refers to, the camp, for example, and that's what he is referring to on page 10. You will find the name. First of all, here too, he already introduces the concepts of the subjective, the objective, extreme violence, and then he mentions, you will see the name of Agamben. Agamben, this Italian philosopher that is mentioned by Balibar toward the bottom of page 10, who speaks about, wrote on the state of exception or emergency that we already saw last week with Walter Benjamin, right? And then, he mentions his book. And the concept, especially, you will find there of a bare life, bare life, naked life, okay, which is the situation to which very often people are reduced or thrown back into, like again, the camp is the uh, tragic and perfect illustration of this, and this is what Agamben in his book, also Homo Sacer, Sovereign Power and Bare Life, he speaks of. The camp, he says, the concentration camp, the refugee camp, the camp becoming the paradigm, Agamben says, of the biopolitical paradigm of modernity. Okay, maybe I have to say a few words about this. Biopolitical is, of course, politics applied to life. Politics is always applied to life, but it is also the question of the power of life and death, that sovereign power is, right? Supreme power. I mean, we saw this again. Think about the Antigone, right? And the relationship, the confrontation between Antigone and the king, who is also Antigone's uncle, Creon, right? Who makes the new law, the new decree, whereby anybody who is going to bury Polynices, right, the brother who's killed, right? I mean, the two brothers fighting against one another, killing one another, but one of the brothers will be left unburied by decree, the decree of the king, right? And and anyone who's going to try to bury this, right, to give a proper burial to this person, then will be executed in turn. And that's the whole tragedy of Antigone. That's the way it unfolds, that Antigone says, you know what, I'm going to not to comply with the law, because this law is simply unjust. It's no law at all, right? So that opens up the whole question, if you will, in a sense of civility that Balibar is speaking about in this essay, although he doesn't mention Antigone per se, but I say in the context of this class, you can link this essay to that moment, okay, in the class as well. The question of the conflict between ethics and the law, and violence and politics, the question of civility. But in any case, he speaks of, and he goes back to this question of the camp and of a bare life. But another concept that I want, because I'm highlighting moments, concepts, on page 11, is the concept of a threshold. Threshold, which is also close to the concept of a border, the border about which Balibar has written a lot. But in any case, this threshold, and he links this, he looks at this in terms of precisely by speaking again about extreme violence, right? Extreme violence, he says on page 11, is by definition an uneasy, even paradoxical notion. It indicates a threshold, right? That's what he says. Now, think about this, read what he says, think about this threshold, and then he gives some examples, tragic examples. He goes back to the question of the threshold on page 12, right? I mean, he speaks of the intolerable, that which cannot be tolerated, which is also the threshold, the thresholds of the intolerable, right? I mean, he says rather it is to problematize the very notion of threshold, and so on and so forth. That's what he's speaking about, okay? And and then you find on that page 12, highlighted for you also this word that may be new to most of you, trans individual, to which he goes back. He will use the word also on page 19 in important ways, okay? The trans through, so let me read that sentence. I believe that this limit, he's speaking about the threshold in relation to extreme violence, and then he speaks also the question of identity, what is the making of identity, which is also problematic, the relationship between identity and non-identity, identity and difference. I mean, very often our identity is the result of a violent process of normalization, institutionalization. That's basically the idea. Okay, so I believe that this limit I'm reading is tentatively reached when brutally or insidiously manifest by means visible or invisible through three instances that inverts. There is an inversion that trans individual conditions of individual and social existence. He goes back to this on page 19 in similar ways. Basically, whatever we usually understand as the individual that we saw already problematized when we did Spinoza, we did Nietzsche, and certainly then also with the essay we read by Eva Kitei, this idea, fictional notion of the independent, sovereign individual, right, that doesn't exist as such, is actually, right, the result of this inversion, because what we have is instead the trans individual. That's the point, okay? I mean, I can't go into that further, but, think about that. I mean, the individual is, to say the least, a reductive understanding of what each person, each one of us, each singularity is, which is a combination, let's put it this way, of so many things at the level of the emotions, the level of relationships, and so on and so forth. Trans individual, there is also the pre individual stage, but trans individual, it is more than simply the individual that then it appears to be. So there is this inversion, okay? And then actually you will see that there is a very interesting, at the end of this page, and again I had to be quick, Balibar mentions the name of this important philosopher, Simone Weil, right? And he quotes her, right? I mean, he quotes Simone Weil from her commentary on Homer's Iliad, and she speaks in that commentary, in that work of hers about force and therefore violence, right? I mean, force is that, that's the quote, right? Balibar quoting Simone Weil, right? Force is that which makes a thing of whoever submits to it. And then I skip, two lines, and this can also be related back to Sophocles' Antigone, the tragedy we saw. But this is a very powerful line by, again, Simone Weil, right? The force that kills is summary, and crude, right? There is this and therefore crudity and cruelty, the force that kills. Again, if we think about this latest terrible case of police brutality, the killing of George Floyd, we can see very well what this means, right? And then a few lines below, Simone Weil, quoted by Balibar, says, in all cases, it changes the human being into stone. That's force, that's violence, right? And then again, we can't read everything, but he's speaking about extreme violence. He goes back to the question of a bare life in on page 14, bare life and torture, which is another, of course, example of a political violence, of a extreme violence. Then the camp on page, I had to skip important moments, but again, read these highlighted sections, pay attention to them especially. But on page, for example, 16, he does speak about the camp again, and also he mentions Guantanamo. Again, I can't go into all these things, but I leave that up to you to check these things out, right? And make sure that you understand what this is, the references, what they are. At the end of page 16, he mentions Primo Levi. He mentions on this page Hannah Arendt, a philosopher, very important philosopher, who she made, then he goes back to her concept of the banality of evil that you find actually then later on page 23. But here he speaks of Hannah Arendt, the camp, Guantanamo, which is of course a more recent, again, tragic situation, and Primo Levi. At the end, at the bottom of this page, and he goes back, right, this is page 16, he goes back to all these things, including Primo Levi, and this notion of the gray zone that you find at the very bottom of page 16, and then again on page 23, right, which is similar to the threshold that we saw before, okay? So then, and Primo Levi is an Italian, Jewish Italian writer who was in the concentration camps during World War II, and then he was a chemist. Then he became a very important writer, and I can't go into that now. But then ultimately, at the end, he was already in a relatively old age, but he took his life probably because of the difficulty of dealing with this terrible situation, tragic situation, and so in any case, you can check some of that, as well as the name of Hannah Arendt and her notion of the banality of evil, very important, right? I mean, the banality of evil is fundamentally the result of, for Hannah Arendt, of thoughtlessness, right? The not knowing what one is doing, not understanding what one is doing. Okay, so meaning that evil things are not performed, evil actions, whatever that means, by people who have a special kind of right makeup and so on. But it is that what she points out is that anybody who stops thinking about what they're doing can be can commit situations of brutality, of atrocities in war. Typically, she's speaking about, right, I can't go into that now, but about the horrors of the Nazi regime. I mean, she was a German Jew who then escaped, like many did. Last time we saw Walter Benjamin also, right? He didn't make it, but she was able to then escape and go to Paris and then New York, and so in any case, I can't go into that. You can check that out as well. The banality of evil based on thoughtlessness, which can make people do things that then are, of course, from the ethical, political point of view, the human point of view, horrific. And again, for this, one doesn't need to have a special predisposition. It is again not a genetic or whatever situation of we saw the question of character, moral character in Aristotle, how this is formed basically by repetition, by habit, by thinking also. But this thoughtlessness can make everyone act in precisely terrible ways by hiding oneself. For example, behind the excuse, I'm just following orders. That's the point in the banality of evil, right? I mean, I did what I was supposed to do. It was my job, and so on and so forth, right? So in any case, because and I see that time is running fast. So on page 22 you find the distinction between the ultra objective and ultra subjective modality. Maybe I speak about this a little, read some things. He's speaking about the distraction of politics, right? And the question, the destruction of two modalities, right? The destruction of action, and he says that he calls these two modalities the ultra objective, which is reducing and bringing human beings to the status of things to be eliminated or instrumentalized at the will of the world of commodities, and that which I call, Balibar says, ultra subjective, making individuals and communities prey to the delirium of the sovereign power, right? The executors of a plan to liquidate the forces of evil. So in any case, then he goes back to the question, like I anticipated, of the gray zone, the concept of the gray zone on page 23, and you find there the notion that I mentioned before of the banality of evil, precisely. Okay, so that's very important, and then. On page 24 and 25, he speaks about the question precisely of civility, and you can read that section as well, right? I mean, I would, this is 4 lines from the end, the bottom of page 24. I would relate the idea of civility, he says, in contrast to the movement of, and I spoke about this in a sense earlier, identification and disidentification, or perhaps in parentheses of a distinction within even identification itself, right? Without which there is no human solidarity. But think about the problem of, again, when we say identity, we actually mean identification, right? And consequently to the retreat from even the power of the collective. So then he speaks about citizenship, and he says there must be a proper moment of civility in politics in order to introduce the demand of, this is important, I mean, in the last few minutes, I want to emphasize this, the demand for anti dash violence, anti-violence. So he doesn't speak about non-violence, but anti-violence, violence, anti-violence, not even counter-violence. He speaks of anti-violence, and that's what civility is. Okay, ora, what is this? He calls, right, he continues, ora, he says resistance to violence, okay? That's civility. Particularly resistance to that reactive violence that produces violence and allows it to become generalized, right? What is this resistance to violence? We had to think about that. Again, I leave that to you to elaborate on, but this is the, constellation, if you will, of notions, concepts, ideas, problems that you had to think about. Okay, so this relationship between politics and violence, the destruction of politics, extreme violence, and then also the possibility, what this civility is, this resistance to violence as anti-violence, right? And so that's basically what the problem really is. And then he goes again. I can't mention everything, but touch on anything, but everything. But on page 25, toward the end of this essay, he again goes into speaks of Arendt, right? This philosopher that we already saw, who coined the right forged the notion of a banality of evil. Maybe I can say a little more about that. And so he speaks about this, and he says for Arendt, this is 3 lines from the bottom, page 25, right? For Arendt, the crisis of the nation, for which she forged the expression stateless, right? And then he goes into that. What is it with stateless? What is the nation? What is it that we mean by that? And what is? I leave this to you to think about. the question of being without a home, like Antigone then ultimately says. You can link this back to that, and the question of the camp, the question of extreme violence, of say total institutionalization, the question of a bare life, which is not to be protected any longer, right? Bare life, that's what it is. The political, legal level, for example, the lack of protection, that's bare naked life in that sense, which is very often, unfortunately, the destiny, right, for many. But I stop here. I hope I gave you a few elements so that you can write this last assignment for this semester for the class, and I hope you enjoy the semester, and I hope to see many of you in the Zoom meeting that we will have on Thursday the 11th. Okay, thank you, bye.